The final layer of this story is not about the sister alone, but about us, about what we choose to see and what we refuse to acknowledge. Because the truth is unsettling, her family was not unique. Across America, behind white fences and manicured lawns, in cramped farmhouses and broken city apartments, the same pattern repeats. Exposure, shame, silence. Generations trained to protect appearances while sacrificing the innocent within their own walls. It is not rare, it is common, and that is the real horror. Her name is forgotten now, buried under dust and death. But the memory of her suffering lingers in the way we avoid certain conversations, in the way we excuse cruelty when it comes from blood, in the way we would rather protect a family's reputation than confront the truth inside it. That house is not just hers, it is a mirror. If you look into it long enough, you might see your own bloodline staring back. Perhaps that is why the story was hidden for so long, because once you know it, you cannot unknow it. Once you step inside the walls of her home, you realize how fragile the idea of family truly is, how quickly love turns to control, how easily protection becomes surveillance, how silence can cut deeper than any blade, and you are forced to ask yourself a question far more terrifying than ghosts or legends. What if the people meant to save you are the very ones who will destroy you? The sister was exposed in her own family home, but her suffering does not end with her. It continues in every whispered secret, every locked door, every child who learns too early that their body, their privacy, their very being is not their own. And unless we are willing to face these stories, unless we are willing to drag them from the shadows and stare into their ugliness, they will keep happening. So when you leave this story tonight, do not comfort yourself by saying it was only hers. Ask instead, what stories lie buried in your own history, in your neighbors, in the house down the street? Because the past is not past. It lives on, waiting for someone brave enough to uncover it. And sometimes the most haunting ghosts are not the dead at all, but the living, carrying secrets they were never meant to bear. There are those who would argue that the past should be left buried, that stories like hers serve no purpose except to disturb. But I ask you, what happens when we bury too much? The soil becomes heavy with secrets, and one day it gives way, spilling everything we thought we had hidden. Her story is not just hers, it is a pattern, a reflection of thousands of others who lived and died under the weight of similar betrayals, never spoken, never named. Families that looked perfect from the outside, yet carried rot in their foundation. In every photograph from that household, her eyes tell the story. You can see it if you linger long enough, the way her gaze shifts away from the camera, the stiffness of her shoulders, the subtle plea for escape that no one dared acknowledge. That is how trauma hides in plain sight. It becomes coded into posture, into silence, into the smallest gestures that only a careful observer can read. But by then, it is too late. The brother lived as though nothing had happened. He carried no visible guilt. Men like him rarely do. The mother aged into bitterness, defending her silence as protection, though it was nothing more than complicity. And the grandfather, he died with the satisfaction of knowing the old order had been preserved, that the family name had been kept intact, no matter what was sacrificed. For them, the cost was acceptable. For her, it was everything. And so the sister became both witness and victim, trapped between the roles of survivor and ghost. She lived her life in fragments, never whole, never free. And though her body aged, her mind never escaped that house. It clung to her, invisible but unrelenting, until her final days. Some say she died quietly, but I do not believe there is such a thing as a quiet death for someone who carried that kind of weight. Every breath, until the last, was an echo of the betrayal that had defined her. When we look back on stories like hers, we are not just remembering a single life. We are staring into the reflection of our own bloodlines, asking ourselves, what silence have we allowed to linger in our homes, and at what cost? If you're still watching, you're already braver than most, because by now, you've stepped into a place where history refuses to stay buried. And I want you to ask yourself something. What would you have done if this was your bloodline? If the betrayal came not from strangers, but from the very faces framed on your family's mantle? Tell me in the comments below, because the question lingers like smoke. There are no easy answers. The sister's exposure became the defining moment of her existence, though she never chose it. Long after the house was quiet, after her betrayers had either died or moved into their own graves of silence, she carried the memory like a second skin. Some scars you cannot see, yet they mark every choice you make. She distrusted intimacy. She recoiled from kindness, assuming it to be a trap. And when she did try to speak, when fragments of the truth slipped through her guarded lips, she was met with disbelief. People don't like stories that make them question their own blood. They prefer denial. They prefer to believe that monsters live outside the home, not within it. But the evidence of her suffering was everywhere, if you knew where to look. In her writing, where she spoke of eyes that never stopped watching. In her art, where figures stood faceless in corners of darkened rooms. In her silence, which was not emptiness, but a scream turned inward. And still, the world moved on, as if her pain was invisible. That is perhaps the cruelest truth of all, that trauma leaves the survivor in plain sight, but unseen. The home itself aged into ruin, but memory clung to its walls. Some who dared to step inside years later swore the air was heavy, that the rooms felt smaller than they should, as though the house itself had shrunk under the weight of its own secrets. A home like that does not decay like any other. It festers. It holds the echo of every withheld cry, every whispered humiliation, every stolen fragment of dignity. It becomes less a house and more a monument, a shrine to the kind of suffering no one dares to speak aloud. And in that silence, her story lingers, not as gossip, not as legend, but as a reminder of what can happen when the walls of a home turn inward, closing on the one who was supposed to be safe inside them. There is a peculiar cruelty in the way communities respond to stories like hers. Everyone knew something was wrong in that household, but the truth was treated like a contagious sickness, something to be avoided, not confronted. The town was complicit, as towns often are. Neighbors kept their distance, convinced themselves it wasn't their place to interfere, and in doing so, they allowed the family's poison to deepen. That is the unspoken rule in so many parts of America. What happens within a home stays there, no matter how violent the silence becomes. For the sister, exposure was not just an event, it was a sentence. Once her private self had been unveiled before her own bloodline, she was never allowed to reclaim it. Her identity, her dignity, her womanhood, each was shaped not by her own choices, but by the gaze of those who betrayed her. Every mistake she made became permanent, every misstep immortalized within the cruel theater of her family home. The worst prisons don't need bars, they only need eyes, unblinking and unforgiving. The brother took a sick pleasure in what he had done. To him, her humiliation was power. To the mother, it was a lesson, a twisted justification wrapped in silence. And to the grandfather, it was tradition, the old cruelty of men passing judgment on women within their own bloodline. This cycle had been repeated before, perhaps not in the exact same form, but in spirit, in method. Because families like theirs did not invent cruelty, they inherited it, like land, like debt, like blood. It is here that the line between family and predator dissolves. What does it mean to share blood with someone who destroys you? What does it mean to sit at the same table with those who strip away your humanity, then ask you to pray before dinner? For her, every ritual, every hymn sung in church, every holiday toast, every passing smile was a reminder that her life had been rewritten by people who should have died before allowing such a wound to form. And yet, she endured. That is the part that unsettles me most. She lived on, scarred, silent, but breathing. Which raises the question, is survival always a victory? Or is it another kind of curse? Time has a way of covering tracks but not erasing them. What happened in that house was buried beneath Sunday smiles, polite conversations at the market, and carefully chosen words spoken to neighbors who never asked the wrong questions. But the sister carried the truth in her body like a scar only she could feel. She walked through the world as if her skin was thinner than everyone else's, as if every glance could pierce her, every whisper could summon the memory of being watched, judged, and stripped of her humanity by those who called themselves family. People who knew her later in life described her as distant, unsettled. She smiled rarely, and when she did, it never reached her eyes. Some said she was paranoid, others said she was cold, but the truth was simpler and far darker. She had been taught, brutally, that trust was a lie. She had learned too young that even the people who raised you can destroy you without leaving a mark for the world to see. Her brother's laughter still echoed in her mind, her mother's silence still burned, her grandfather's approving stare still followed her into adulthood. Trauma does not dissolve, it calcifies, it becomes part of the bone. The tragedy of her story is not just what was done to her, but what was stolen from her. The chance to feel safe in her own body, the freedom to explore mistakes without being crucified for them, the comfort of a home where doors close and privacy means respect, not vulnerability. These are things most people take for granted, yet she lived her entire life without them. Even years later, even far away from that house, she would wake in the night certain that someone was watching, because in her mind, someone always was. The house itself became a kind of tomb sealed by silence. When it finally emptied, when death and time claimed the family one by one, what was left behind were fragments. A Ken photograph in an attic trunk, scribbled notes in the margins of a Bible, whispers passed between aging neighbors who never dared to intervene. But if you listen closely, if you look long enough, you can feel her presence there still, not as a ghost in the traditional sense, but as something heavier, a reminder that some homes are built not to protect life, but to preserve suffering. And hers is one of those. The family name had weight in that town. Old money, old land, old sins. People nodded when they passed, smiled politely in the church pews, and pretended not to notice the sickness that clung to their home like mold on rotting wood. That is the American way, isn't it? To praise the surface, to bow before respectability, while never daring to ask what rots beneath. For years, the sister was just another daughter, another face in the photograph, another shadow standing obediently in her mother's kitchen. But those who looked closely, really looked, saw the cracks forming long before the collapse. Her bedroom was never hers. Privacy did not exist in that house. Doors left unlocked, windows watched, footsteps that lingered too long outside her room. Even the way her brother's voice shifted when he spoke her name was enough to make the air heavy. She was a possession, not a person, and every day she woke in that house was a day her own blood measured how much of her could be taken before she broke. The cruelty was not sudden, it was patient, slow, almost ritualistic. That is how evil hides best, not with rage, but with routine. And when the inevitable came, when her secret, her private moments, her stolen attempts at being human were dragged into the open, it was not an accident. It was planned, exposed not to the world, but to the very people who should have been her shield. Her body, her mistakes, her fumbling steps into adulthood became ammunition for those who controlled her. They didn't need chains. They had shame. They had exposure. They had her cornered in her own home. Imagine the silence at the dinner table after everything had been revealed. Forks scraping against plates, eyes avoiding hers, the weight of her humiliation stretching across the room like smoke. No one needed to speak. The message was clear. She was theirs to dissect, theirs to watch, theirs to ruin. And this was not discipline, it was spectacle. And in that suffocating performance the sister disappeared piece by piece until only the family's version of her remained. That is the horror of exposure. Not the secret itself, but the knowledge that once it is revealed within your bloodline, there is nowhere left to run. The home is no longer a refuge. It becomes the cage, the stage, and the grave. Beneath the thin walls of America's forgotten houses, silence has always been a liar. Some homes whisper their truths quietly, too faint for the world to hear. But there are other homes, where the walls scream in their stillness, holding secrets too poisonous to breathe. Tonight, we enter one of those homes, a place where the illusion of family, the smiles, the dinners, the Sunday prayers, was nothing more than a stage, hiding a story so grotesque that even the graves outside the town refused to speak of it. It is the story of a sister, exposed, not by strangers, not by enemies, but by the bloodline that should have protected her. The house still stands, peeling paint, broken shutters, the faint smell of mildew sinking into every board. But if you step inside, if you dare, you don't just find dust and broken glass. You feel the memory of eyes that once watched each other too closely, of a family that lived in the kind of silence that cuts deeper than any scream. And at the center of it all, a girl, a sister, not innocent, not guilty, but trapped, bound within the cruel theater of her own home. Her every step, her every glance, a performance she never agreed to give. She did not need strangers to destroy her. Her undoing came from within, from those who shared her name, who knew her voice, who sat at her table. There is a particular kind of betrayal that does not fade with time. When a brother, a mother, a grandfather turns the warmth of home into a weapon, it carves into the soul in ways no outsider could. This is not just her story, it is America's story. Because behind many front doors in this country, stories like hers fester in shadows, waiting to be forgotten. And yet the past has a way of bleeding through. Old letters, fragments of photographs, whispers carried through neighbors who saw too much, but spoke too little. From these fragments, the truth begins to reassemble itself like bones rising from the soil. And the truth is this: she was not simply exposed. She was stripped of her privacy, of her dignity, of her very sense of self, within the same walls that were supposed to shelter her. That is where the horror begins.